Welcome to the 8th interview of Resistance. Today we're going to talk to Will Davies about his 2018 book, Nervous States, or How Feeling Took Over the World. So thanks again, William, for having accepted the invitation and the time. And so I have as usual, I have some introductory note about the author. So a little of your background, and then I will start with some questions. And so William Davies is an English writer of political and sociological theories. His work focuses on the issues of consumerism, happiness, and the history and function of expertise on society. Davies has written for a variety of newspapers and periodicals, including The Guardian, New Left Review, London Review of Books, and The Atlantic. Davies is professor of political economy at Goldsmith, University of London, where he's co-director of the Political Economy Research Centre in London. It's still true, yeah?
Yes, that's all true, yeah.
Okay, so, and you've published books, amongst them The Limits of Neoliberalism, Authority, Sovereignty, and the Logic of Competition, 2014. The Happiness Industry, How Governments and Big Business Sold Us Well-Being, 2015, and Nervous States, the book that we're going to talk today about, 2019, and This Is Not Normal, 2020, The Collapse of Liberal Britain. So my first question, William, is actually why this book, especially after the Happiness Industry, if I'm not wrong, and specifically why the book has two different titles. I mean, one of them is like Decline of Reason, and the other one is like How Feeling Took Over the World. Is it, I suppose, like in America and in England, probably you have published it.
The question of the subtitle is there's a rather mundane answer to that question, which is that there was a different publisher in the US from the UK. So it's published by Norton in the US and by Jonathan Cape in the UK. And the American subtitle is Democracy and the Decline of Reason, which I guess is a slightly more sort of, how to put it, I don't know, a rather more kind of stately, rather more political type of title. I mean, there's a lot of books in the United States that are about sort of, the crisis of democracy, because democracy is such an important part of American identity and so on. So, I mean, it's really no more significant than that, actually. But yes, that's what publishers do in their different territories.
But again, the question is that I suppose, if I'm not wrong, this book was published after the industry of happiness industry, and then. I mean, you deal with happiness, you deal with well-being, you deal with the fact that well-being has been wrapped up in consumerism in the industry. But then now you shift to feeling, like the general thing, emotion and feeling. So what brought you to this title, Nervous? Not this title.
Well, that bit of the title is a kind of pun, really, because it's about both political states that are in a state of nervousness and of not really knowing where they are positioned in the world and what the future holds and so on. And it's also about a more kind of physiological sense of nervousness, as in when we are in a nervous state, we have a heightened responsiveness to and an anxiety towards our immediate circumstances. To feel nervous is to be over aware of one's immediate situation. So you get nervous before you go on stage, and you become aware of your, what are my hands doing, and my heart is doing this. And to be nervous is to be extremely alert to one's condition and one's situation. And part of the thesis of the book is that some of our political malaises of recent times stem from technologies and media technologies in particular, but also a sort of an economic system which is designed for real-time feedback more than it is designed for the provision of reliable, stable reports about the world. In terms of the context of the book, I mean, it came out in 2018. The previous book was 2015. I mean, Nervous States is, I think, quite, I'd like to think it's more than this, but, being honest, it's one of the books that was written and commissioned in response to some of the democratic shocks that particularly in the English-speaking world of 2016. So obviously there's Brexit and Trump, and I mean it's a bit of a cliche, and I feel in some ways embarrassed by how parochial this makes me sound. But I mean there was obviously a huge set of concerns which may have been focused on the English-speaking world. I don't think exclusively, because after all there was also other forms of populism which were sort of accelerating at the time, with Salvini in Italy and these sorts of things. But yes, it was about a sense that the political structures that appeared to have been fairly kind of stable were being sort of destabilized in certain ways, and particularly by these forms of incipient nationalism that were manifest in the UK and the US as elsewhere. But I mean, yeah. So the book began in the summer of 2016. I'll be honest about that, and then it was published 2 years later.
All right. In the introduction, you set out the central theme that will shape the book, having given an example of how panic set in when crowds in London thought that shots were being fired. You suggest that the impact of social media operating in real time means that we place more trust in sensation and emotion than in evidence. Knowledge becomes valued for its speed and impact rather than its objectivity. When we believe that we might be in physical danger, rapid response seems appropriate. Is your concern in the book also that the world is changing at dizzying speed? I mean, is speed also another?
Speed is a big part of it. I mean, I think you touched there on a kind of key part of my thesis about knowledge, which is think practically about what knowledge is, what counts as good knowledge. And this is an odd question because some people might say, well, knowledge is either true or false. But I'm informed by a pragmatist tradition, and I'm interested in what we want knowledge to do for us socially. And there are kind of two answers running through the book. One is knowledge as a form of as something that functions as a type of promise, which is a little bit like the type of a witness statement that someone makes in court or to the police, or for that matter, in the science laboratory, when they say, I conducted this experiment and I promise you this is what happened. I mean, if scientists started to lie about what they'd seen, then the whole scientific edifice breaks down. Or if social scientists lied about their surveys, it does happen, but the whole thing begins to break down. There is a kind of moment of there is an implicit promise in this kind of knowledge, and that's the kind of knowledge that we have that is at the heart of the scientific enterprise. It's the heart of the Enlightenment. It's also, interestingly, in ways that I discuss briefly, and this stems from the history of science as written by people like Stephen Shapin and Mary Poovey, similar to the type of promise of a banknote. It's like, I pass this on to you because I promise you it's real. There's a sense of this thing has a kind of, it will retain its validity as we pass it around. And that's a bit like a fact, is that it's something where, if I get something from, the BBC or from a particular scientific journal, I believe I can pass it on to someone else and it's still going to be good, kind of thing. It's not like an anecdote or a rumor. Then there's a second kind of knowledge, which is knowledge that where the temporality counts for everything. And one example of that would be something like, a stock tip. So, by the way, this company is about to do this, is about to make some announcement and its stocks are going to go through the roof, but no one else knows about this. So you do it today, you make lots of money. That's knowledge where the timing counts for a great deal. And that is the kind of knowledge where when you're in the situation you talk about, where you're in a kind of a crowd where there is a sense of a threat or a physical danger, and of course, I don't use biological arguments, but you could say that in an evolutionary sense, we are sort of designed for what is called fight or flight. Like we have these kind of sensory organs that, if we feel like we're in danger, we very quickly kind of need to know about it so that we can run away or we can fight or whatever. And that's knowledge that is just as important as the promised knowledge. It's just as important as kind of facts, but it serves a totally different function, which is not to achieve sort of a shared reality or trust. It's knowledge which is primarily aimed at securing our survival, our profit, our sort of private gain in some sense, or our private survival, potentially at the cost of others. But it doesn't necessarily tell us give us a picture of the world which is stable or robust in terms of how it can be kind of shared around, because it's completely rooted in the moment. Now, the point about social media is that social media, that second kind of knowledge is already, as my example already shows, it's already manifest in, say, financial markets with, things like right up to the extreme case of high frequency trading, which is the sort of ultimate manifestation of that. The digitization of financial markets over the 80s and onwards meant that, this became a kind of constant game to have knowledge as sort of quickly and as available as possible. Mm-hmm. Social media does that to social and civic life as well, because effectively, everything is about knowing things quickly. Everything is about,
real time.
Real time. And therefore, this question of the sort of having knowledge which is valued for impact, for speed, for being sort of in the moment, suddenly starts to engulf these other areas where in the past, only 15 years ago, if I wanted to know about politics or or society or weather or whatever, I opened the newspaper and I got a sort of a static view through the rear view mirror, if you like, a report that had been compiled over the course of several hours about things that were now already in the past. And in that sense, there was a kind of course, newspapers lie, newspapers make mistakes, newspapers do all sorts of bad things. We know that. But in its kind of formal properties, it is knowledge that is assessed and developed and presented in a way that is closer to something more like a fact than to something like a sentiment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, although your focus is on knowledge and there's these two kinds of knowledge, I suppose still there is enough room to discuss, especially the buzzwords like accelerationism, acceleration, speed. I have this I have a paragraph from the collected and unpublished writings of Mark Fisher, where you read that the acceleration of information exchange is producing an effect of a pathological type on the individual human mind, and even more on the collective mind. Individuals are not in a position to consciously process the immense and always growing mass of information that enters their computers, their cell phones, their television screens, their electronic diaries, and their heads. However, it seems indispensable to follow, recognize, evaluate, process all the information if you want to be efficient, competitive, and victorious. But in a paragraph, you say that objectivity and expertise are no longer sufficient to achieve political and economic objectives. So there needs to be a new configuration of old Enlightenment ideals in order to take account of the speed with which the world now operates and the different levels of what it means to be human that are accessed and mobilized by digital technology. I mean, I try to sort of differentiate. It seems that in your book, there is some tacit optimism to return to the Enlightenment values, something that I can hardly see in Mark Fisher's paragraph.
Yeah, I mean, Mark Fisher's work, funnily enough, maybe, that piece of Mark Fisher's writing, I don't know the broader context of that. And he was, after all, someone who was quite close to accelerationist arguments at Warwick. He then tried to develop a kind of a left accelerationism. But then, later on, he actually, I think was rather more skeptical of particularly of things like social media. He was very skeptical of. I'm not sure. In terms of my optimism, I think part of what I was saying in the bit, what I've written is simply trying to explain why sort of facts and Enlightenment ideas of reason and dialogue are no longer working. And that's something which I've been interested in lots of other pieces of my academic writing and elsewhere, sort of like what is going wrong? Why do people no longer understand each other? Why do people not seem to want to understand each other? There's a kind of nonsense that pervades a lot of kind of, digitally enabled discourse and discussion. And I think that, I'm not that optimistic that can be easily fixed. I think that what I was suggesting is that political leadership, political organization, obviously needs to try and exploit both the two kinds of knowledge that I was talking about earlier, in the sense that, you know, if you think about what is it that, I mean, look at the left today. There is some fairly effective use of media and social media for mobilization and organization. So it's quite, you know, maybe less so than the right in some ways. I mean, after all, you know, which is the fear, is that, I mean, that's the real fear, is that these technologies, by privileging speed, have certain kind of, you know, privilege a sort of a politics which is obsessed with speed, which is a potentially fascist politics, which is the one which sort of celebrates speed purely in and of itself, and also speed sort of celebrates kind of destruction in and of itself, which is a kind of I guess another aspect of accelerationism. I think that one of the challenges for the left is, you know, when there are more kind of traditional, sometimes quite liberal forms of empirical analysis of the world, say, you know, take someone like Thomas Piketty's work, or equally, you know, Marxist work by David Harvey or something like that. You know, there is a challenge in trying to uphold a kind of respect for a sort of some kind of objective. Because after all, figures like Marx himself, David Harvey, and so on, these are inheritors of the Enlightenment. These are not thinkers who kind of want to sort of undermine knowledge, or to smash knowledge, or to replace it with something else. These have a rather kind of quite traditional idea of how reason works. It's just that it's reason in the service of emancipation. So, you know, I don't know exactly what the answer is, but I think that part of the challenge is how to take advantage of some of these tools, which are particularly good at mobilizing people, but they're pretty useless when it comes to establishing any form of broad consensus, or what, you know, Marxists might call hegemony, because all they ever do is mobilize, remobilize. They're also quite divisive. They're extremely good at energizing, moving people, sort of sometimes enthusing, sometimes generating other forms of affective response, but that they don't, they're not very good at establishing the forms of consensus on which a sort of broad overlapping, sort of hegemony or sort of broader democratic agenda might be built. Now, I don't know exactly what the answer to that is, but partly what I was trying to do in the book was to diagnose the problem. But I do think that the let's call it the Enlightenment vision of knowledge has not disappeared. I mean, universities and traditional media institutions and so on, yes, they're being influenced by forms of marketization and financialization, which make it harder for them to perform their functions, but they haven't disappeared. I mean, and there are still scholars and critics and analysts and so on out there that need to be kind of properly listened to, and which have not been corrupted purely by the need to demonstrate sort of return on investment and impact and clicks and that kind of stuff, which is what's really undermining it elsewhere.
Yeah. There is a part of the book that I really enjoyed after discussing mind-body issues in the likes of Descartes. I mean, in a brilliant chapter, you center the physical body in political discourse. I suppose the chapter is like body politic. Those suckered in by populist and nationalist movements, both in Europe and US and elsewhere, tend to be those living with pain, chronic illness and depression. Pain creates, as you say, an absence of narrative, while populism, by challenging resentment, provides one. Could you please elaborate on that? I mean, I really just want to share my joy.
Yeah, I mean, so partly it was a sort of an observation of some of the curious correlations that were coming out about both, you know, some of the areas. It's important, first of all, to say that a lot of the people who vote for some of these kind of nationalist projects are rich, privileged people living, you know, benefiting from the model of the economy and so on. I mean, most of the people who voted for Trump, most people who voted for Brexit are actually sort of fairly kind of wealthy people in their sort of, you know, 50s, 60s upwards. But nevertheless, there are these kind of pivotal voters on the fringes that made all the difference. And they have, you know, in the case of the Trump vote, there were these interesting correlations about what have been called the deaths of despair by Angus Deaton and Anne Case around the Midwest, where this sort of an excess of kind of ennui or nihilism or something leads to these kind of endemic chronic health problems and addictions and toxins in society. I think that there were these kind of equally sort of hopeless towns in England that voted for Brexit, particularly sort of some of the kind of coastal towns, deindustrialized towns, former kind of mining regions of people who basically had no kind of economic sort of investment or prosperity for, since the early 1980s. And a lot of these places do suffer from a kind of some of these kind of physiological kind of decline as well, and declining life expectancy. It's really very kind of shocking. Equally, some of the parts of France that have a very strong Le Pen vote in the northeast and these sorts of places, again, they were showing, although Le Pen's vote is a lot younger than many other nationalist projects elsewhere, that life expectancy was substantially lower than in Paris and these sorts of places. So this was a sort of interesting kind of point, which is that, okay, it's partly just a reflection of economic deprivation and so on. But one of the things which interested me on a kind of more philosophical level, which was about this question of pain. And also, of course, there's the whole kind of cultural, political problem of painkillers in American society, which is this sort of absolutely devastating phenomenon of opioid abuse in the United States, which has been this kind of obviously atrocious phenomenon over the last sort of 10, 15 years. But is pain started to interest me in a kind of physiological or philosophical sense, in the sense that pain challenges modern Western ideas of diagnosis in some way, because diagnosis has a sort of dating back to kind of early modern medicine in the 17th century. The idea is that you have a symptom, you have disease symptom diagnosis. So you have disease, which is the kind of underlying problem. You have symptom, which is how it presents itself. And then you have diagnosis, which is the sort of doctor's gaze, which kind of connects the symptom to the disease and sort of puts it into a category. And this is a kind of nice, tidy rationalist project, which goes around using with a kind of representational epistemology. Whereas pain is sometimes, in certain cases, particularly with sort of back pain and forms of pain which are psychosomatic, is not really disease or symptom or diagnosis. It kind of challenges this kind of representational kind of hierarchy, I suppose, because in some ways it's just pure. It's the nervous system simply emitting negativity, emitting distress. It's a pure neural response, really. And I suppose I was partly interested in how pain and some of the ways in which pain treatment, and this is what you refer to as sort of the question of narrative, some of the pain treatments, but people who live with chronic pain, maybe they've had an accident, maybe they, maybe whatever it might be, something to do with particularly with the back and the neck and so on. But a lot of, pain treatment can often involve trying to come up with a narrative, trying to come up with a story about pain, because part of the problem of pain is the lack of the inability to represent it. It has a kind of very sort of private quality. I mean, and so narratives often, and trying to kind of come up with a sort of understanding of cause, and how it fits into a kind of life story and a narrative can actually become important ways of treating pain. And I was sort of, I suppose in the book, I was partly thinking about this as an analogy to our political condition, which is that in some ways, when the body politic experiences pain in the form of a sort of mute forms of distress, which is, what do I want? I don't know what I want. I don't want anything. I just don't want this. This is just not good. There's a kind of like a sort of, what postmodern theorists of postmodernity called the kind of end of grand narratives, and that, voting for, say, Trump or whatever it might be is partly just a sort of, it's not really, of course, it's a make America great again, but on some level, it's just like, well, no, just not this bullshit any longer. And I think that it's partly an analogy to what's happened to our body politic, which is the sort of, that there is just sort of pain without narrative, and someone comes along and promises to kind of give it a story. But then there was also, I think I was interested in the fact that, maybe in some ways, our idea of voting behavior, which political science likes to think of people voting in terms of their interests, there's something quite naive about that as well, and that maybe people, vote in terms of their sort of affective state, their sense of their place in the world, in a more kind of existentialist sense. And maybe you might even go as far as saying that this is partly conditioned by whether or not their body, what condition their body is in, and what sort of whether the world feels like a pleasurable or an unpleasurable place to be. So I mean, those were sort of some of the themes in that section of the book.
You say that, I mean, I quote you, that contemporary notions of truth, scientific expertise, public administration, experimental evidence, and progress are all legacies of the 17th century, end of quote. You trace it back to 17th century and to two key developments in the evolution of modern politics: the attempt to distinguish reason from emotion, and the desire to separate out war from peace. Why are you emphasizing on these two criteria, if I'm not wrong?
Yeah, I mean, this, I used Thomas Hobbes at some length in the book, who is the British political theorist of the mid 17th century. And Hobbes was very influenced by Descartes, who was the French philosopher from the similar sort of early mid 17th century. And both Hobbes and Descartes were what we would call rationalists in a philosophical sense, in as much as they were suspicious of empirical data and were looking for the possible philosophical principles on which some kind of certainty could be built. And ultimately they thought of mathematics as being sort of beyond any type of doubt, that 2 + 2 = 4 is true across the entire universe, and it doesn't matter what what your senses tell you about the world, that remains true. I think that yes, so the separation of the idea that the mind is separate from the body, which is an idea that is made most expressly clear and most famously by Descartes, is also the foundations of the idea of, as you mentioned, reason and emotion. But ultimately, the idea of there being a rationalizing mind that sits outside of the body, is not reducible to, they say, the brain or whatever it might be, is a very important sort of building block for the rest of the modern project, for the development of a type of knowledge that is has an authority independently of physiology, of culture. Of course, there's a whole other set of things to say about how this whole project was never really admitted women or people of color or colonized peoples, none of whom were considered to be capable of separating their minds from their bodies in this way. So this has always been an implicitly white, masculine European project. That is important to stress. But nevertheless, that idea that it is possible for knowledge to not simply be a kind of an artifact of our sort of of our bodies is very important to the development of Western science. Hobbes, meanwhile, was particularly concerned by, in order for Western society to develop in a commercial sense, in a scientific sense, the first thing that people need is, it's all very well being rational, but if you're fearing for your life, if people might come and sort of, break into your house and kill you and steal your property, then you're not going to make many scientific or commercial advances. And Hobbes's political project was all about trying to identify the kind of principles on which human beings could shift from a society of what he called the state of nature, or war of all against all, into what he called civil society, which was a society grounded in law and in the imposition of rules that were which were imposed by a sovereign power. I mean, I think it's quite a lot to kind of get into it. It's difficult to sort of go into this without opening up too many bigger issues. But these are in some ways related projects. This kind of mind-body project and this kind of war-peace project. These are related projects, because in some ways, what Hobbes was, I mean, the threat of war is the threat that ultimately we live in fear of pain and in fear of death, and effectively our physiological, our mortal qualities constantly haunt us. We fear for our lives, we fear for our bodies, we fear for the lives and bodies of our families and our loved ones and so on. So we're unable in a state of war to focus on questions such as what is truth, but also Hobbes was very enthused by the development of early commercial and mercantile life. So these two projects have common origins in the 1630s and 1640s, at a time when Europe was beset by religious wars, the 30 Years' War, the English Civil War, which were conflicts that were both philosophical, because they were about the nature of truth and the nature of God, but they were also obviously, mortal and absolutely disastrous. I mean, the 30 Years' War in Europe was, took a huge number of lives and set back the development of destroyed a huge amount of wealth and so on. So the question of how could Europe get out of a situation in which truth led to mortal combat was a kind of was the sort of the beginning really of the Enlightenment. Because normally when people talk about the Enlightenment, they're talking about something much later, from the sort of mid 18th century through to the early 19th century. Whereas this is going back really 100 years before then, to trying to get back to the absolute fundamentals of how could people live side by side while sort of disagreeing with each other.
Right. And another dimension of the book is its focus on the political impact of growing inequalities. And you draw upon recent research in the US, which both explains how issues of resentment and the loss of confidence in experts and professional politicians has deepened, and also how this has led to the election of Donald Trump and Brexit vote in the UK. What are the results or effects of experiencing such inequalities when it comes to international politics? I mean, does it explain, if not justify, resentment in international politics as well? Although you avoid utterly a romanticized idea of enlightenment, you also are very critical of new atheists in some parts of the book. It seems that you have left to a large extent the analysis of feeling and emotion in the global south, let's say. As a person coming from Iran, I would say that, and with all the history I've been shaped with, from coup of Mossadegh to the revolution and war, and also sanctions now, I believe that plenty of the feelings in Iran now are created there in reaction to the inequalities in the international world politics.
And I accept that the book is primarily focused on the global north, and as I said at the beginning, I'm conscious that its immediate context was some of the particular disruptions in North America and Europe, so and in particular in the English-speaking world. So I have to sort of acknowledge that, as I say, that slightly parochial element. I think that one of the resentment. It's interesting. There's a good book called The Politics of Resentment by Jeremy Engel, and in that he argues that resentment actually is, we think of it maybe as a sort of negative thing, because it sounds like it's a sort of jealousy or something like that. But Engel, checking I've actually got his name right. Is it Engels? Jeremy Engels, The Politics of Resentment. But in that he argues that actually democracy has always been fueled partly by resentment, because actually, and he goes back to ancient Greece, and that actually it's partly resentment that prevents aristocracy or prevents some kind of oligarchy, because it's a sense that resentment ultimately is a form of it's a form of anger with the injustice of inequality, and in that sense it's quite righteous. So it's odd that we often hear of it as having a sort of negative element. I think that what some of the resentments that were particularly important in the United States with the election of someone like Trump are resentments that don't necessarily sit with people who are kind of more complicated. So there's partly the resentment that people of color were beginning to kind of, the sense that people of color are kind of black people in particular were sort of catching up with white people too much or overtaking them, as if, like, or that China is sort of, taking all America's jobs. Equally, there's an interesting sort of finding, which I mentioned in the book, which is that people who vote for these right-wing populist parties, as in with Trump and so on, display what political psychologists call relative deprivation, which means that they're not deprived at all, but they feel deprived relative to who they consider their peers to be. Now, one of the problems with a society such as the United States is that people are constantly looking upwards the whole time. So it's like, oh, look, Elon Musk has got this. So everybody right up to kind of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk can look upwards and want to outdo them. So there is a kind of, the logic of gazing at celebrity culture and so on is to make people feel resentful, make them feel like they're losing when they're not. Now that's about what's going on in the global north and in the west. I think that elsewhere, I think that I'm sure there are implications about this for international politics more generally. I mean, of course, that's not how a lot of kind of national democratic politics plays out, and particular movements tend not necessarily to be aimed on the international stage. But you're right that that it's a weakness of the book that it doesn't look at the global south, and it doesn't look at the kind of international dimensions of some of these same forces, but I'm sure there could be some implications extracted.
Will, one of the interesting aspects of the book, I mean, one of the major themes and interesting aspects to me is the term that you use, like a weaponization of everyday life or everyday thing, which is undermined any meaningful distinction between war and peace. Could you please elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose this metaphor of weaponization, which has become quite common, over recent years, is quite interesting. I mean, I think that, so obviously the idea of a weapon implies something that is a tool of violence. In the book, I talked about, use Hannah Arendt's way of understanding violence, which effectively is a sort of the capacity to. So it's been a while since I read all of this actually. But I mean, effectively, there is the something that is available to anybody, which is to destroy without justification, which is to simply to act in a decisive and destructive fashion. And one of the things that, one of the areas where the idea of and of course, if people are using, if you're calling something a weapon, and you're accusing someone of using something as a weapon, you're accusing them of acting violently, and in that sense of having kind of breached the limits of the Hobbesian civil society, or invited some kind of punishment in return. But this notion of weaponization implies that there is a kind of grey area between the sphere of non-violence and the sphere of violence, because it implies that there are certain things that might belong in the sphere of civil society, but with a very simple different kind of aspect change can suddenly be seen as belonging in the sphere of violence. I mean, one of the sort of simple examples I use in the book would be the way, vehicles can be suddenly weaponized by driving them into crowds or driving them into buildings or something like that. And these are vehicles that weren't designed as weapons, like a tank is designed as a weapon. These are normal cars and civilian airliners, but suddenly they become weaponized in certain ways. Right. One of the things that's happened with social media is that effectively, language itself gets weaponized in certain ways. In that, you can, or content gets weaponized in that someone can be. I mean, the idea of a troll is of someone who effectively uses digital technologies and uses the other people's social spaces online with a view purely to disrupting them and rendering them unviable any longer, to sort of breaking them in some ways. So equally, if I'm reading someone's work not with a view to understanding it, but with a view to plucking out, 4 or 5 words that shows them to be, in the worst possible light, which is something which happens quite a lot now. People trying to kind of effectively sort of harm people online in various ways. That is a kind of an example of a kind of weaponization, because it's, in some sense, turning sort of a space of civility into something else. I mean, that's really what that aspect of the book is about. And the reason it's interesting to me is that it makes me think kind of one of the main themes of the book, and it also goes back to the question of pain, because the interesting thing about pain is that it straddles mind and body in some ways. It's not clear if it's psychological or somatic, but equally this idea of these weaponized sort of tools and discourses breaches some of those kind of key 17th century sort of binaries that we were talking about earlier of sort of mind and body and war and peace.
You just talked about this relative deprivation. I mean, when people like Martin Nussbaum or René Girard, like in France, connect a lot of our political conflicts to personal modes or inclinations like envy, greed, jealousy, anger, I don't see that much of this tendency in your book, in your project, like to connect something personal, something human to the socio-political crystallization of that. Am I right? I mean, like they're in their project, like when I read René Girard, I see that, okay, some like envy in personal interaction, in the very minuscule macro-political interactions, it can be manifested in social and political macrocosm. Right. I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I don't talk about it in the book. I don't think I disagree with that. I think I'm perfectly willing to accept that the sort of the intimate and the public, or the personal and the political sort of interact in lots of different ways. And I think it's clear that you think about an emotion like anger, that often anger works in unpredictable and unpredictable ways, in which isn't always the way we might wish it to. It'd be nice if people got angry with the right person at the right time, but often they don't, and they end up getting angry with the wrong person at another time, basically. And I think that explains quite a lot of political activity. I mean, but I think equally, people who suffer a political injury in a public sense might end up taking that out on people in a more kind of tragically in a more kind of private domestic space. So I don't disagree with that. I think I just didn't really sort of address that in the book.
Well, I have two short questions now. I mean, one of them is not that short. No, I see that. I mean, you say, I quote you, part of the appeal of war, at least as an idea, is that unlike the civil society designed by the likes of Hobbes, it represents a form of politics where feelings really matter, end of quote. Do you mean that the discourse of war is a way to mobilize feelings which are otherwise useless, or canalize them? But then we are living in an age where, according to, as you say, Russian General Valery Gerasimov, war is no more declared. There are plenty of people, for example, in Iran, in my personal experience, who think that there is a war waged and instigated against Iran, against them, let's say through sanctions, without being clearly declared.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think this is right. I mean, part of what my book is about is, I don't use that example. There's a very good book by Nicholas Mulder called The Economic Weapon, which I'm not sure if it's out yet, but it's about the history of economic sanctions, about precisely this, that, turning trade, weaponizing the sphere of trade is, obviously has been a major kind of policy as used by the United States and various other countries over the last, I think he dated back to the kind of 1920s. But so, yes, so this means that war is fought not just on the battlefield, it pervades all these other spheres. I mean, in the book, I talk about the ideas of Clausewitz, the Prussian general and theorist of war, who was a great admirer of Napoleon. He was also a great admirer of the French Revolution, and he connected the role of the French Revolution, which was a very kind of impassioned popular movement involving a lot of feeling, a lot of crowds, a lot of mobilization of people around a particular national project, that this gave Napoleon a capacity in battle that other countries didn't have. And this is like led Clausewitz to rethink his whole idea of what war was because he realized that these people who were sort of specialists in war, like the Prussian generals, were useless in comparison to a military movement that was founded in mass popular sentiment, fundamentally. So that Napoleon had many more soldiers. They weren't very good, but they were very enthusiastic. That was sort of give it longer. So effectively what Napoleon did was to show that the limits of war there were no limits. Anything could become part of a kind of war, and also he was able to harness the economy in different ways. He was able to harness women in different ways. He was able to move things around at much greater speed, so that war no longer had a kind of fixed limits like a kind of game of football. It was sort of potentially everything. So yes, sanctions are an example of an economic weapon, and sanctions generate different sentiments and different feelings and different resentments and different forms of nationalism and democratic participation, because they are unrelenting. It's not like something where you have a beginning and an end, and there's a winner, in the way that these Prussian generals wanted wanted war to be like football. Instead, war is closer to a sort of as Clausewitz famously said, it's politics fought by other means. And that's the thing, is that the division gets suspended. And this is also the Gerasimov doctrine that you've referred to, where Gerasimov says, that war no longer needs to involve basically armies and the military. And this, of course, is also, this has been linked to the fact that, we know, whether or not you think the Russians handed Donald Trump the presidency, we know that there was substantial Russian interference in the 2016 election, which may or may not have been to do with the hope that NATO would be weakened and this sort of thing. So it's clear that what's called full spectrum warfare is part of Kremlin policy, but then it's part of Washington DC policy as well, and that would include something like sanctions.
Right. So my last question, hopefully shorter, is that do you have any? I mean, like, given that you've written a book about nervous states and the feelings taking over the world, we have experienced COVID-19, and then there was this, like, let's say, the fear amongst people, like the fear that was in some cases led to some conspiracy, in some cases like instigated some reaction to scientific understanding of this phenomena, around the globe. Do you have any observation about the experience of COVID-19 in terms of like feelings and reactions?
Well, it's certainly been a real moment of everybody's had to kind of understand more about what facts are, what science is, what the politics of science really is. Which, in the past, it wasn't that long ago, if you said that science was political in some ways, people would think you were a kind of crazy postmodernist who was, oh, you're like Foucault, you think everything's just about power. But now it's perfectly clear, like in terms of the ability to combat something like a virus involves, scientists are part of it, but this involves political structures, and questions of political legitimacy and political power, and of course also policymakers are primarily operating under conditions of very sort of limited knowledge a lot of the time in fast-moving environments. So in a way, like you look at back at March 2020, there's been a lot of discussion in the UK about the fact that the government didn't react properly for about 3 weeks, and that may have cost tens of thousands of lives. Why didn't it react? What would it mean for a government to what was different about our government from other governments which did react? These are sort of, so the question of what counts as sort of valid data and what is reliable data, and what does one do about data? All of these questions have been kind of massively increased. I think also there's a sort of recognition that a lot of like a virus is obviously a sort of something that the temporality of a virus is crucial, the way it moves around at different speeds, and the ability to harness real-time data in order to tackle it has also been greatly amplified and illuminated, so that countries such as South Korea that have fought it very, very effectively, but have also done so with quite high levels of surveillance, of testing capacity and this sort of thing, partly because of the experience of SARS. But it's I think some of the themes in my book have certainly kind of been absolutely central, I think, to all of this. I'm not sure I have any words of wisdom about what to make of COVID. I mean, it's a different world we're living in from only sort of 5 years ago, obviously, and the question of knowledge, and also then there is also the issue of these sort of skeptic communities, the conspiracy theorists, the anti-vaxxers, that's another interesting part of this, of really what drives their skepticism and their cynicism about science is really about a cynicism about power and politics. And, that's an interesting issue as well, of how people who feel unrecognized or feel resentful towards elites and the state will in certain circumstances also become kind of skeptical about science. So we begin to see how closely entangled the scientific and political projects are.
So you don't believe, Will, that this experience of pandemic slowed down this maddening speed of this sort of knowledge you were talking about, this second form of knowledge? I mean,
well, I mean, in some ways, it's sort of forced. I mean, not necessarily. I mean, I think it's obviously been bad news for. Maybe it cost Trump the election. It's forced. The reliance on science has clearly risen to some extent. But at the same time, I think it's meant that people possibly live in an increasingly nervous state, in the sense that people, spend a lot of their time. We spend more time on digital technologies because of closures, of lockdowns, and so on. And there is, I think, a sort of sense of that things are in constant flux. Like we don't really know. Our sense of what exactly the next few months looks like is really not. In my society anyway. People don't really know. Like that's a very unusual situation to be in, to live in this situation of not being entirely clear, not being able to take very much for granted. And there may be benefits. It may be that people value what they do have more highly as a result, but it's also quite unsettling, I think. And there's a lot of anxiety around. Anxiety has been one of the most pronounced kind of mental and physiological responses.
Yeah.
Great. All right. Good to talk to you. And
my pleasure. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.